The automated warning lights on the main bulkhead of Outpost 4 pulsed with a rhythmic, sickly amber glow that illuminated the frost creeping across the reinforced windows. Outside, the howling methane storms of Archer IV tore across the frozen plains, whipping sheets of jagged ice against the titanium plating with the force of a sandblaster. Commander Vance stood with his palms flat against the cold metal of the central console, watching the external pressure gauges drop toward a threshold that no standard atmospheric shield could withstand for long. The colony was scheduled to be completely deserted within the week, but the shifting weather patterns had drastically shortened their window of survival, turning a routine evacuation into a desperate race against the clock. Vance reached out to adjust the frequency on the long-range comms terminal, hoping to catch a signal from the corporate transport fleet that was supposed to be inbound to clear the final sector. The static hissed back at him with an unrelenting white noise, unbroken by any reassuring voice of corporate coordination or military reassurance. He wiped a streak of greasy condensation from his forehead, his breath pluming in the chill air of the command deck as the life support system struggled to maintain a baseline temperature. Every worker, miner, and engineer under his command trusted him to ensure they got out safely, and the heavy burden of that trust weighed far more heavily than the gear strapped to his back. The console finally chimed, but instead of the expected automated flight confirmation, a flat, synthesized voice echoed through the static-laden speakers from sector headquarters. Governor Vane's direct line had opened, bringing with it an official directive that immediately made the hair on the back of Vance's neck stand up. The corporate administration had recalculated the cost metrics of the sector's mineral yield against the fuel required to weather the storm, deciding that the outer rim assets were no longer worth the expenditure. Vance stared at the blinking data stream on his screen, realizing with sudden clarity that the corporate command had no intention of sending the extraction fleet back for the remaining colonists stranded in the deep sublevels. Governor Vane's voice continued through the comms channel, devoid of any human empathy or hesitation, spelling out the cold reality of corporate bureaucracy. Commander Vance, you are instructed to immediately secure your personal scout vessel and rendezvous at coordinate point Delta 9 with the primary fleet, the synthesized cadence droned on relentlessly. All remaining personnel in the outer sectors are officially categorized as non-essential operational loss. Do not attempt rescue operations. The atmospheric inversion will render surface travel entirely impossible within the hour. Vance gripped the edge of the metal console so tightly his knuckles turned completely white, the fury building in his chest threatening to override his professional training. He thought of the 280 civilian workers, families, and independent contractors who had spent years breaking their backs pulling rare ores out of the permafrost just to meet the relentless corporate quotas. They were not numbers on a spreadsheet to him. They were his neighbors, his crew, and friends who shared rations in the mess hall every single evening through the bitterest winters. To abandon them to a frozen death simply because a distant board of directors wanted to shave a fraction of a % off their quarterly shipping costs was an outrage he could not accept. Governor, Vance said, his voice dropping an octave into a dangerous, controlled register that signaled his absolute refusal to comply. The MAG trains at Site B are stranded due to an unexpected power surge, and those families cannot walk through a Category 5 methane storm. We need at least 2 heavy transport shuttles deployed immediately to lift them out before the pressure drops further. Your request is denied, Commander, Vane replied sharply, the artificial warmth in the automated relay completely dropping away to reveal pure corporate coldness. Compliance with evacuation protocol is mandatory. If you choose to remain on Archer IV or harbor unapproved personnel past the deadline, your commission will be revoked, your assets frozen, and you will be classified as a permanent corporate deserter. Consider this your final warning. The transmission clicked dead, leaving only the dull, monotonous hum of the failing life support generators to fill the silence of the command deck. Vance stared at the dark screen for a long, quiet moment, feeling the immense weight of the choice before him as the final bridge to his old life burned away. He did not hesitate, he reached down, gripped the main transmission transceiver panel with both hands, and ripped the heavy metal unit straight out of the bulkhead with a shower of angry sparks. He dropped the smoking piece of hardware onto the steel floor and crushed the internal circuit boards beneath the heel of his heavy work boot. Computer, Vance said, his voice ringing clear and steady through the empty, freezing room as he initiated the emergency protocols. Ready, Commander, the shipboard artificial intelligence responded promptly, its chime sounding oddly cheerful against the grim reality of the situation. Lock down all exterior airlocks across every habitat ring, and reroute auxiliary power from the executive suites directly into the residential heating grids of Sector B. Warning: executive quarters power is required for standard comfort protocols, the computer noted analytically. Rerouting will result in sub-zero ambient temperatures in command sectors and administrative offices. Do it, Vance muttered, pulling his heavy thermal parka tighter around his shoulders to block out the invading chill. And broadcast this audio loop across every emergency civilian frequency we have left. This is Outpost 4. Vance is still here. We aren't leaving anyone behind. 3 days later, the planetary weather pattern shifted violently, bringing down a full-scale atmospheric inversion that hit the surface with the unrelenting fury of a dying star. The outpost groaned from foundation to roof, every rivet and steel beam popping like rifle shots down the main corridors as the hurricane-force winds battered the exterior shielding. Inside the central mess hall, 300 people, humans, rugged alien miners, and grease-stained mechanics, sat huddled together around makeshift thermal heaters, sharing blankets and meager rations. They were not trained soldiers, but rather ordinary working people who had trusted the corporate system implicitly, only to find themselves cast aside when the weather turned foul. Kalen, the grizzled chief engineer with a patch over his left eye and soot permanently embedded in his skin, jogged into the command deck with his breath pluming heavily in the freezing air. Commander, the outer thermal seals on Habitat Wing C are failing under the pressure, Kalen reported, his voice tight with exhaustion. The wind is chewing through our emergency backup generators faster than we can feed them fuel cells. Take the thermal blankets from my quarters and hand them out to the families in Wing C, Vance instructed immediately, not looking away from the external sensor grid that monitored the encroaching storm front. We gave our personal blankets away yesterday, sir, Kalen protested, shivering visibly as a draft swept through the open hatch. The crew is freezing to death at their posts. Then we put on another layer, Vance snapped, though his own fingers were growing stiff and numb inside his heavy work gloves. Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic ping cut through the ambient roar of the generators, stopping both men in their tracks as the tactical display flared bright red. Sir, Kalen shouted, his eyes widening in disbelief as he pointed toward the long-range sensor console. We've got inbound radar signatures dropping out of orbit. Heavy tonnage, military configuration, completely running silent against the storm front. Vance leaned over the glowing display, tracking the 3 sleek, black-hulled enforcement corvettes as they slid silently through the howling upper atmosphere above the outpost. They didn't broadcast any identification codes, nor did they respond to standard navigational hails, choosing instead to use the blinding cover of the methane storm to mask their approach. Heavy kinetic boarding tubes hissed to life along their bellies, extending outward like metallic fangs designed to pierce through an airlock and deliver armed corporate security forces directly into the facility. Why are they here? Kalen whispered, a cold wave of horror dawning on his face as he watched the enemy vessels maneuver into precise orbital holding patterns directly above their ridge. The storm is too severe for a rescue operation. Are they dropping reinforcement teams to help us evacuate? Look closer at the telemetry data, Kalen, Vance said grimly, a cold realization settling into his gut as he analyzed the weapon arming sequences. They aren't positioning to airlift anyone out. They are locking their primary railguns onto our exact geographical coordinates for an orbital strike. An orbital strike? Kalen stammered, his face draining of all color. There are 300 civilians huddled in the HAB rings right below that ridge. We're part of their own corporate workforce. Not anymore, Vance replied, his teeth gritted as the enemy ships charged their weapon capacitors with a menacing blue glow. Under interstellar maritime law, if a populated colony sits on an undocumented mineral claim, the resident workers retain a significant percentage of the extraction rights. But if the entire settlement is wiped out by a natural environmental catastrophe, before those claims can be legally registered, The corporation claims 100% of the mineral rights without paying a single credit of back pay. Kalen finished the sentence, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound shock and rising fury. They didn't leave us behind just to save fuel on the transport runs. They engineered this entire weather disaster to cover up an illegal resource grab and wipe out every witness on the surface. Above them, the 3 black enforcement corvettes completed their alignment, their primary weapons glowing with enough energy to vaporize Outpost 4 down to the solid bedrock in a matter of seconds. "Commander, our local shields are down to 12% capacity." Kalen screamed over the shrieking alarms that now echoed through the entire facility. "We don't have heavy anti-air batteries or missile silos. If they fire, we're dust." Vance looked down at the tactical map, then at the security monitors showing the frightened, exhausted faces of the families huddled together in the mess hall. He knew there was no escaping the kinetic bombardment through conventional flight, but he also knew there was one ancient, analog communication relay mounted on the roof that the corporate sensors had neglected to encrypt or disable. "Kalen," Vance said quietly, a grim, defiant smile breaking through the stubble on his face. "Do you remember when you asked me why humans are famously considered the most stubborn creatures in the galaxy? Sir, we are about to be vaporized by our own bosses. This really isn't the time for a history lesson. Get down to the sub-level junction and patch the main generator directly into the roof relay," Vance ordered, slamming his hand onto the manual override console to unlock the broadcast circuits. "And override every single commercial frequency channel from here to the core worlds with an open feed." "What are you planning to send?" Kalen asked, hesitating for a fraction of a second as the first warning shots from the corvettes began to scorch the outer perimeter rock formations. "Not a distress call," Vance said, his eyes fixed on the charging weapon arrays of the corporate fleet displayed on his monitor. "A history lesson. I am broadcasting our entire operational log, Governor Vane's direct audio orders to let us die, and the corporate extraction manifests live across every public holnet and merchant frequency in this quadrant." Before Kalen could argue further, Vance slammed his palm onto the global broadcast key, sending the raw data surging upward through the atmospheric interference. To every independent merchant, every outer rim trade union, and every free captain listening across the dark, Vance's voice blasted out, riding the powerful atmospheric wave straight through the storm and past the corporate jamming arrays. "This is Commander Ethan Vance of Archer IV. The Directorate is currently executing 300 innocent civilians to cover up an illegal mineral grab. If you have a conscience, and if you hate corporate tyranny as much as I do, come see how humans handle people who leave their friends behind." High above the frozen surface, the corporate corvettes abruptly hesitated in their firing sequence as their targeting computers were flooded with millions of simultaneous data pings. Across the galaxy, independent freighters, Union ships, and civilian captains instantly downloaded the live feed, the leaked documents, and the horrifying coordinates of the massacre unfolding in real time. "Sir," Kalen screamed from the comm pit, pointing frantically at the deep space radar array. "Look at the outer system relay. Hyperspace punctures. Hundreds of them. Thousands of civilian warp signatures are flooding into the sector." Vance looked up at the main viewport just as the dark void of space tore open with blinding flashes of brilliant blue light through the swirling vortex of the methane storm. They were not a military fleet dispatched by a galactic superpower, but rather an unprecedented assembly of everyday people answering a call of conscience. Heavy independent freighters, armed civilian haulers, outer rim militia patrols, and independent syndicates poured out of hyperspace by the thousands. Drawn together by a universal code of honor that corporate algorithms could never calculate, that a community protects its own, they formed an unbreakable wall of hulls around the frozen rock of Archer IV. The massive civilian armada flooded into the sector, their broadsides locking instantly onto the 3 terrified corporate corvettes with terrifying synchronization. A wall of shimmering energy shields snapped into place between the warships and the surface, completely neutralizing the enemy's ability to fire upon the outpost below. The emergency comm channel crackled open loudly in the command deck, bringing Governor Vane's voice back through the speakers, though it was now utterly panicked and stripped of all its former corporate arrogance. "Vance, Commander Vance, shut down that broadcast immediately. This is all a dreadful misunderstanding. We can negotiate a settlement. Vance calmly reached out, picked up a heavy steel wrench resting on his console, and brought it down with full force directly across the communication array, smashing the hardware into a shower of silent, harmless sparks. He turned away from the ruined console and looked toward the open doorway of the command center, where Kalen and a dozen grinning engineers were watching the glowing armada light up the dark sky like a constellation of hope. "Come on," Vance said, wiping a smudge of grease from his forehead and feeling an immense weight lift off his chest for the first time in years. "Let's go tell the families that we're finally going home." As Vance and Kalen walked down the steel-plated corridors toward the central mess hall, the atmosphere inside the facility had transformed entirely from one of despair to overwhelming relief. The colonists were already packing their meager belongings, sharing joyful hugs and shedding tears of disbelief as the holographic displays projected views of the massive civilian fleet holding the corporate oppressors at bay outside. Children ran up to Vance as he entered the room, tugging at his jacket and asking wide-eyed questions about the incredible ships shining like stars through the storm windows. Kalen leaned against the doorway, watching the commander interact with the survivors with a quiet, fierce pride that words could scarcely capture. The corporate blockade had tried to erase them from the ledgers of history, but instead, they had sparked a movement that echoed across every charted system in the galaxy. The miners and engineers realized then that they were never just disposable assets on a balance sheet. They were human beings bound together by an unbreakable loyalty that no corporation could ever buy or destroy. Outside the reinforced hull, the corporate corvettes attempted to break the blockade, only to find themselves completely boxed in by thousands of independent vessels refusing to yield an inch of space. The corporate commanders realized they were completely outmatched, not just in sheer numbers, but by the raw, unyielding spirit of a species that refused to abandon its friends in the dark. The evacuation proceeded smoothly under the watchful protection of the civilian armada, with every single colonist safely transferred aboard the welcoming ships while the corporate fleet retreated in disgrace. Vance stood on the ramp of the final transport shuttle, taking one last look back at the frozen landscape of Outpost 4 before sealing the hatch behind him for good. He knew his old life of quiet compliance and corporate employment was gone forever, replaced by something far greater and more meaningful than he had ever imagined. As the shuttle lifted off through the clearing methane clouds into the bright expanse of space, Vance looked out at the endless fleet of independent ships escorting them to safety. He understood now that humanity's true strength had never lain in its technology, its weapons, or the cold calculation of empires, but in its fierce, stubborn refusal to let anyone walk alone. The journey ahead was uncertain, but as he looked around at the faces of his friends and family, Vance knew they would face whatever came next together, exactly as humans always had. If you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.